Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining the conference this morning. Hope you all had a good weekend. My name is Kate Jenkins. I work for the Energy Saving Trust. Unfortunately, we've had a couple of technical difficulties this morning. Philip Sellwood, our former chief exec, is supposed to be chairing this meeting, but at the moment we can't get him online. So I'm just introducing the session. Hopefully we'll get him on at some point, but we've got two really good speakers who I'm sure will share some interesting insights in the meantime. So today's keynote panel is entitled, "If It's Not Just, There Is No Transition." Our two panelists, Dragomir, Tzanev, Executive Director of Centre for Energy Efficiency, EnEffect, and Stefan, Bouzarovski, Professor of Human Geography at the University of Manchester, and Associate of the Institute of European Energy and Climate Policy. They'll cover different approaches taken across Europe and the extent to which social aspects need to be considered. As I'm sure you're used to, each panelist will make a short presentation and then the floor will be open to questions. Please type your questions via the live Q&A chat box at any time, and remember to include the speaker's name before your question so that we know who to direct the question to. The discussion forum is where you can engage in general discussion with fellow delegates, share your thoughts and experiences. However, this is not the area for questions, so please make sure you enter your questions or comments to the speakers in the Q&A chat box. I do encourage you, though, to enter your thanks or appreciative comments to the speakers in lieu of a round of applause at the end of the presentations. Also, please do not use the raise hand feature, as this will not be monitored. If at any point throughout the session you require technical assistance, please submit a ticket using the red live support icon at the top right of your portal. Should we experience any technical difficulties, an announcement will be made. To enable full screen mode so that you can see the presenter's PowerPoint slides in a larger format, please select the two arrows at the top of the session screen. So first of all, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Dragomir. Sorry, I think Philip is about to join us. If you just
Hopefully I am. Hey, thanks very much indeed, Kate, for stepping in at the last minute. A few technical details, a few technical issues there. I just wanted to, by way of introduction, give a few comments before I introduce our two guest speakers. Hopefully Kate has given you all of the housekeeping. The title, as you know, is "If It's Not Just, There Is No Transition." If the process of transition is not just, then the outcome never will be. That's a direct quote from the Climate Just Alliance, which sums up really both the challenge and the ambition, which will be discussed in this keynote session. In facing the challenge of a just transition, it's obviously not only an issue facing individuals with affordability of energy and declining incomes. The transition to net zero is faced with the need to ensure structural inequalities at local, regional and national levels are faced with honesty and transparency. Whilst the green recovery and transition offers the prospect of significant employment opportunities as new technologies develop and mature, so it's also true that the opposite is true. As electric vehicles, for instance, replace traditional fossil-powered passenger cars, gas-fired heating is superseded by heat pumps and hydrogen, then the scale of job losses in traditional industries such as coal and oil will be globally significant, but regionally potentially catastrophic if not faced with realism. The distributional challenges of these structural shifts should not be underestimated in terms of their impact on local communities and regions. At a more granular level, the impact of these changes also cannot be overstated. We all agree that in order to meet the 2050 net zero outcome, then action is needed, and needed quickly, as the UK's Climate Change Committee never tires in emphasising. the importance of the decade up to and including 2030 is absolutely vital. In terms of environmental policy, we should be acutely aware of the time lag that accompanies action on climate relative to some of the benefits accruing as a result of those actions. Economic and social benefits often lag environmental ones. So think whole house insulation and retrofit, which incidentally is why timely and accurate evaluation of these policies is so critical. Who and how these costs of environmental and social policies will be levied. Currently, in the UK, for instance, costs are levied via household bills, which economically is both fiscally and socially repressive. Is it not time to move away from this approach as others in Europe and further afield have done? As we move in Northern Europe from gas as a predominant fuel, sourcing for domestic energy heating, to electricity, should not the social tariffs be applied to reflect these moves? In many countries, natural gas as a primary fossil fuel is still massively advantaged in terms of subsidies and the levying of tariffs on electricity bills, which increasingly are generated by clean, renewable sources. And I don't think this situation should be allowed to continue if we're seeking a truly just transition. Pricing and how the zero transition is paid for by households, localities, and ultimately countries is a significant set of barriers to overcome. In the UK, the latest budget figures reveal that 3.2 million, or 13.5% of UK households, are classified as in fuel poverty. As we move to a low carbon future, it's essential that all households have the capacity, access and agency to take advantage of cheaper tariffs that smart technology is now beginning to provide. We must prevent a reoccurrence of the prepayment system developing to prevent a system of tariffs becoming a default for those most vulnerable in our communities. Giving households and communities access to the financing mechanisms which are appropriate to individuals and individual circumstances can and will go some way to ensuring a more efficient generation and consumption. Whatever direction the transition to net zero takes, what is becoming increasingly clear is that failure to deliver a just transition is just actually not an option. If countries throughout the world are to deliver the outcomes of the Paris Agreement and the tougher agreements that need to be embraced at COP26 in Glasgow later this year, then national governments have to ensure that they've gained social permission of the general public. In part, this license to transition to zero carbon will be gained by all in society that it's just, and without it there can be no sustainable and long-lasting transition. Finally, during the pandemic, we've seen how a crisis can reinforce racial, gender and class inequality. Women bear a disproportionate burden in effect of climate change and what it delivers. Any future transition needs to be built on diverse foundations if we're to take advantage of the skills available to us. Thanks very much for that. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first panelist to the stage, Dragomir Tzanev, who's Executive Director of the Centre for Energy Efficiency in EnEffect, an official representative of municipal energy efficiency. So, Dragomir, it's over to you for your presentation.
Thank you very much first of all, for the invitation and the chance to be a part of this, I think, hugely important and hope very engaging discussion. I hope that you can see my slides and hear me well. If that is the case, I will directly, make a deep dive into the problem. Well, my role here is a little bit more specific. I will try to give you a glimpse regarding the situation in energy poverty in Eastern Europe, and particularly in my country, in Bulgaria. We all know that Eastern Europe is the part of the continent that mostly suffer from this quite overspread social phenomenon. And there is a very good reason for that, as you can easily see from the opening slide, and that's the situation of the building stock. We must confess that we didn't make ourselves a favor by neglecting what is a major part of our national wealth, the legacy that we have from our parents and grandparents, and we have come to a situation where we very often see pictures like that. From the other way around, we are at the moment nowadays having historical chance is probably too much of a word, but really excellent chance to make big steps into the transition in light of the ongoing European policies directed to the renovation of the building stock. And I must share with you that it doesn't take only technical and administrative capacity. It also takes a major shift into the behavior of the residents, the homeowners, and that's something that we would like to discuss today. So, from what position do I share that position with you? I'm representing Center for Energy Efficiency EnEffect, which is an NGO, but it's basically the oldest organization in Bulgaria that is dealing with sustainable energy issues in general. For more than 30 years, we've been collaborating with local authorities within the municipal energy efficiency network EcoEnergy, and that's extremely important in our topic today, because actually retrofitting policies and residential policies in general are managed, operated at the local level. In these decades, actually, we have developed extensive capacity in the services that are mostly needed by the local authorities, and these are technical consultancy, energy audits, design of carbon zero buildings, and also applicable financing schemes, as we are also managing the Bulgarian Energy Efficiency and Renewable Sources Fund. And basically, that organizational graphics would also give you the context of my presentation today. So, going deeper into the problem, we already mentioned that Eastern Europe, and particularly Bulgaria, is unfortunately topping the charts under all parameters that we have and that are monitored within the Energy Poverty Observatory, as Professor Bouzarovski might confirm in the next lecture. And in this regard, we are very much aware about the consequences of energy poverty. We know a lot, unfortunately, about poor health conditions due to the unfavorable indoor environment. We suffer a lot of excess winter deaths, mostly in our countries, and air pollution is also getting a lot of attention currently in countries as Bulgaria and other countries in Eastern Europe. We seemingly forget about the social exclusion, but I would like to stress on this consequence of energy poverty, because energy poverty combined with the decomposition, dismantling of the social safety network that we are evidencing in the past years has really negative impacts on the access to social welfare services, to access to opportunities for personal and professional development. And why we actually know quite a lot about the consequences, it seems that we tend to forget about the major cause of the energy poverty. And that's, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's the situation of the building stock. You can see on the graph, it's quite indicative of the situation that countries with the least number of buildings in higher energy classes suffer the most from energy poverty. And we all know that the poorest occupy the worst buildings, so the consequences are really at hand. And unfortunately, that has not yet been reflected in the development of the policies. So starting with definitions, putting the problem into discussions, we often stumble at the situation that we cannot distinguish energy poverty from economic poverty. And while in the research community there is this obvious consensus that energy poverty is a much broader concept, in the policy discussion, it's still not realized. And the fact is that it's somewhat due to the unwillingness, at least in our situation, of some of the institutions to transform and to further develop the existing instrument for social support, mostly concentrated in fuel subsidies, as we'll discuss a little bit later. Also, the complexity of addressing the causes to building energy retrofit has a role to play in that dimension. And the fact is that we need a combination of both approaches. We need to address the causes, and we still need to mitigate the consequences in order to provide a really inclusive energy transition in the next year, and we really, really need it now. So that's very, very well reflected in the situation that we are facing in Bulgaria at the moment. We are everywhere, we are investing a significant amount of money, over 65 million euro in end-use energy subsidies, fuel subsidies, as we call them, for bad quality wood and coal. And at the same time, we are fighting the air pollution, which is caused by the same bad quality wood and coal, with similar amounts of money. At the same time, in parallel, Bulgaria is investing a huge amount of money, more than 1 billion euro in a program for renovation of multifamily residential buildings in 100% grant scheme. That's very hard to explain usually in that kind of audiences, but really the beneficiaries, the end users, the homeowners do not pay a single cent toward renovation projects. But within this 100% grant scheme, we do not have any prioritization of the beneficiaries, the buildings addressing energy poverty or air quality issues. And where does that situation lead us in the past years? So in the past years in Bulgaria, there are, a little bit more than 2,000 big multifamily buildings renovated with this 100% grant, but they only cover 4% of all eligible buildings under the condition of that program. So if we turn the argument around, it means that 96% of the eligible buildings are left without any support for building renovation. And that means that we are in very clear situation of moving towards increasing the scope of the renovation action. So we really invested lots of efforts from our side in order to try to suggest further development of that kind of support program so that we can at the same time increase the scope, increase the depth, hopefully, and also allow participation of all vulnerable households that are there in Bulgaria. The situation is actually quite dire if we look at it from the perspective of the most contemporary or most widely spread concepts of energy poverty. We actually applied several energy poverty. According to the current British one, it came out that more than half of the population, for certain the first 5 income deciles of the populations, are in risk of energy poverty. Then we studied what would be the impact of deep energy retrofitting, and we found out that with basic renovation measures, the ones that are applied now, we are in a position to move out 2 income deciles of energy poverty. If we go to deep energy retrofitting, the way it should be done, the impact is even higher. Then we tried another investigation, and unfortunately we don't have time to enter into detail, but it's also very indicative. We tried to see what would happen if a certain portion of the existing fuel subsidies are shifted towards renovation programs, which require a certain amount of co-financing by the end owners. And it turned out that in a very reasonable period, around the 12th or 13th year, the public budgets will go into the green area. But also within these years, the households would enjoy the increased comfort and obviously the decreased expenses coming as a result of the renovation policies. So, of course, in order to increase the scope of the renovation action, we must redesign our schemes so that from 100% grant component, we move to a more sustainable scheme that attracts additional private financing. And of course, we must still keep very serious support for the vulnerable households, applying a definition for energy poverty that takes in account not only the economic poverty indicator, but also the indicators which are related to the energy portion of the energy poverty concept. And giving the example from Bulgaria, it's also probably wise to look into other countries from Central and Eastern Europe. We had the chance to recently perform a study regarding all countries that are doing modernization programs, and having the best cases in the Baltic countries. There are some newly arising good examples from other countries in the region, but we have been able to identify actually a number of outstanding barriers, and and one of them is the lack of continuity. It's quite typical for the region, I would say, and it's very much reflected in these programs. We don't have the targeting of the energy component of the energy poverty definition set, and last but not least, there are very obvious signs of limited access to commercial financing in programs operated by commercial banks in general, who are not willing to engage into contractual relations to energy or socially deprived households. So based on this kind of analysis, we are able to come up with a set of policy recommendations. And now moving towards the conclusion of this presentation, they're formulated in 5 major categories. So long-term vision and continuity, something that we need to provide transparency and predictability in policies that would also drive investment action. But we also need to exploit the synergies and the different sources of financing that are coming through the policy action and match them in the building stock, the cause of energy poverty problem. We do need a lot of capacity building, professional administrative for local authorities and actors, but we also need, and I trust that this is very important for that conference in particular, strong monitoring, technical monitoring and evaluation of the outcomes of the policy actions. And that should be the base of the awareness raising campaigns at national and local level, without which the behavior change would not be possible. So we have been happy to be supported by many European initiatives in that direction. And I will just share with you 3 of them. We have a project called COMACT, which would support us in defining energy poverty definitions in combination with suitable financial mechanisms that provide access of energy poverty category. The next project is called Energy Measures, that might be interested to you as well, because they're partners from Scotland and Ireland. Here we will work with the local levels, providing support to different local actors in order to be able to work directly with energy poor households, not only for low-cost energy efficiency measures, but also for behavior change campaign. And last but not least, we were supported by the German government to start a very serious campaign for monitoring of the impact of the renovation policies, seeing the exact situation before and after renovation, analyzing it, and providing communication arguments for behavior change campaigns at national level in support to building renovation policies. We also want to couple that interventions with investigation regarding the opportunities to develop energy cooperatives, also with participation of the local authorities, and we do trust that there is a big potential in that regard. So with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and of course I'm open for further discussion if any of these points have raised your attention.
Firstly, can you continue to submit your questions to the Q&A chat box? I've already seen a couple going in there, so thanks for that. Our second panelist will be known to many of you, as well as Dragomir. Professor Stefan Bouzarovski is Professor of Human Geography at the University of Manchester and an Associate of the Institute of European Energy and Climate Policy. So I'm really looking forward to hearing Stefan's presentation. So over to you, Stefan.
Thank you, Philip. Can you hear me?
Yes, hear you well.
Working fine, and I've just shared my screen. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here today, and I am so grateful for the invitation at this conference. It's a community that I haven't engaged with before, so but clearly extremely relevant to some of the work that I do and my colleagues do. So it's absolutely wonderful to be here today. I'm very generous. Also, I'm very grateful for the generous introduction, also for the mention of my work by the previous speaker. I won't be talking so much about energy poverty today, but rather I will focus on something else. It's a new project that, well, a project that we're just finishing up now, and it's a project that deals with one specific aspect of energy justice, the issue of how we deliver sustainable, equitable, and inclusive urban solutions around these questions of energy efficiency in particular. And so I really want to talk about that today, and I really want to highlight the role of energy intermediaries, of organizations that work essentially at the cusp, at the interface of different types of organizational structures and infrastructural systems as well, and as such are extremely valuable in promoting just transitions. And I want to talk about that and really sort of highlight how important they are for energy evaluation as well, but also how important they are for energy justice more broadly. So my starting point really is this notion of inclusive urban decarbonization. So I'll be focusing on cities. I'm in a slightly different life. I'm more of an urban geographer. So and really there's sort of 3 E's that I want to highlight today. Energy efficiency, of course, how you might improve the energy performance of the residential stock. Also equity, making sure that fuel poor households are included in low carbon transitions, and indeed without them, I would argue there's no point in promoting low carbon transitions. They have to be inclusive. But also, and I would say even more importantly, the question of engagement, how we put people first and how we make sure that communities are adequately mobilized, listened to, engaged with, but also how trust is developed. So this is really the onus of my talk. I want to talk more about those mechanisms of engagement and also mechanisms of energy efficiency and equity delivery in cities, particularly among what we call hard to reach communities. I think it's a slightly problematic term, but hopefully we can cover that a little bit in comments later. So this is based on essentially 3 projects, but primarily one project that's just about to finish, the Step-In project funded by Horizon 2020. I'm also involved in a few others, like I should mention CREDS, that's funded by the EPSRC, and Poverty, that's funded by Interreg Europe. But in the main, I will be talking about Step-In today. And what Step-In does, it effectively creates what we call a living lab approach. Now, some of you may not be familiar with this, and when we say living lab, it's not really a lab. It's not something where you are in a room, but it's more like taking the lab and moving it into an open space, into the city, and creating an approach that involves all citizens, not through the experimentation, not with people in a sort of classical, in an ethically unacceptable way, but more experimentation in terms of engagement methods, in terms of democracy, in terms of participation, in terms of delivery of a particular technological solution and the adoption of those solutions. So this lab approach, in this case of the Step-In project, is applied to the question of fuel poverty or energy poverty, as it is now recognized in the European Union, or energy vulnerability more broadly. And here we really have sort of three aims. We want to look at energy efficiency, thermal comfort, but also citizen well-being. And what's really crucial about these labs is that they engage intermediaries, different kinds of organizations, and really advise to deliver their interventions. And through the interventions, it's not just about energy efficiency. It's really about improving social capacities, improving relations, well-being, but also providing skills and access to resources. Some people use the term flexibility capital. I've used it in my previous work. It's mostly used in relation to the energy market, time of use pricing and so on. But you can think about it more broadly in terms of adaptation to interventions as well. So our living lab works, there are several living labs within the STEP-IN project, but ours works in Greater Manchester. Some of you may be familiar with this. I'm not entirely sure what the audience of the conference is and who's present, but I'll just briefly say, for the benefit of those who might not know some of the details, one of the largest metropolitan, combined authorities, basically metropolitan areas more broadly in the UK. There's a discussion whether it's Birmingham or Manchester after London. I won't get into that, but it certainly is one of the biggest, and in terms of population, 2.8 million people roughly. There are 2 cities in it and 8 metropolitan boroughs, specific type of local authority that you find in England, and those together make up what we call the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. There are, and that map on the top right of my screen is the map of the index of multiple deprivation. Again, I won't go into that because of time constraints, but in Greater Manchester, we have some of the highest rates of deprivation in the UK, and 4 of those local authorities are among the UK's top 25 most deprived. So what do I want to talk about in terms of energy intermediaries today? There's quite a lot of literature. In a way, I'm an evaluator as well, but I'm more of an academic evaluator. I evaluate literature, but I also evaluate interventions. And I've also been evaluating the interventions undertaken by these intermediaries. Now, I won't go into that just because of time, but there's quite a lot that's been written on this, around what they do, how they accelerate low carbon transitions, how they can help us move or challenge some of these questions around a techno-managerial framing of low carbon transformations. I really want to highlight the sort of infrastructural work that they do, some of the emotional labor, some of the care that some of these people do. That they're not just people who deliver interventions, they do so much more. They are, in a sense, doing some of the roles that maybe the state would do or the local authority would do, but they've, due to the specific setup of UK cities and UK governance, post-austerity, but also historically, they're actually undertaking a wider set of roles. And I think what's really important here is that they undertake what's called maintenance and repair. Again, that's a wide literature that I won't go into, but that in sense involves building the city and building transformation from the bottom up and making sure that you work with citizens in the grain of the city to deliver certain types of interventions. Now, and I think what I really want to highlight here is the sort of labor that they do, which is often unrecognized. And why does it matter? Well, think about the whole supply chain for retrofits, for example, and why we saw the recent failure in the UK of the Green Homes Grant, or before that, the Green Deal. And you can see why they matter and why not enough attention has been paid to them, because they are such a crucial element of that supply chain for retrofits, and not just supply chain, but also engagement chain, to make sure that people are on board, and particularly those who might not necessarily be easy to access in terms of these interventions, or they might be also reluctant to undertake them as well. So what have we done in our living lab? We've effectively been looking at how to, in a sense, evaluate the evaluations, evaluate what the intermediaries do. And what the lab does is essentially applies the same sort of methods or techniques or approaches iteratively. So over and over again. Obviously, between each of those iterations, there's lots of reflection, lots of discussion, lots of fine-tuning, sometimes not fine-tuning, sometimes you have entire approaches being scrapped or changed from the bottom up. But really, what it does require is working very closely with the whole ecosystem of organizations in the city. So we've had 3 such iterations, and what's really interesting, and one of the reasons why I can't give you many details results today, is because that last iteration was really undertaken during the lockdown last year. So it actually started, it was meant to start in March when the lockdown basically hit. So we delayed it until May. The previous 2 iterations had started previously from June 2018 onwards, going on for about 9 months each. And then the last iteration wasn't eventually undertaken, but it was all done remotely. So we have lots of unique evidence now about what happens and how you deliver advice during a lockdown and how you engage with people remotely, not necessarily through physical visits, although some of the advisors did drop off some energy-saving equipment to some people even during this period. So what did we do in each one of these iterations? Well, we did things like focus groups, of course, to evaluate things. We did advisor visits, so people dropping in under LEAP. Some of you may know Local Energy Advice Partnership, so that was one of the mainstays of the program. We organized things called energy cafes. Again, some of you may be familiar with this. It's sort of local residents and advisors talking about things in sort of more community-based formats. And we installed energy monitors. Those didn't work. I don't have time to go into that, but that was very, very interesting why they didn't work. Overall, we covered 565 households. Each had about 2 members, so you can calculate that's quite a lot of people. 2 to 3 members, depends. And we did follow-ups to investigate what it meant in terms of the interventions, what happened, and whether people took them on board. Some of the things that people do, they'd upgraded their boilers. This is a bit problematic, and this is something we reflected on, given that we're still working with gas, and I think it's really an issue in terms of how far we can go with these programs. And it would be wonderful if in the future we don't have to give people gas boilers. But I think what some of the other measures that were undertaken mostly were small measures, particularly supplier switching. Referrals were very interesting to different schemes. And I think this is really where the lab really helps. It actually directs people to other services. And what we found very often was one of the biggest problems with mental health and well-being. We found lots of people struggling with hoarding, particularly. We found lots of people struggling with being overwhelmed by energy bills and not knowing what to do. So advisors were really, really great, really helpful for this in this matter. I should say that simply just bill switching across the lifetime of the lab, including the coronavirus pandemic, we managed to save people around 8.5% on their energy bills. Now, that might not seem like a lot, but have in mind that we didn't, that's an average value. And for some people, the values are very, very high. We moved people onto different other services, and that really helped. Again, these are UK specific ones like the Priority Service Energy, a Priority Service Register, a Citizens Advice Bureau. A lot were directed towards things like income maximization that's run by the council and so on. So I think that sort of element where people start to realize that there is support and then they can access support, but also the various upgrades that can take place through these interventions, I think were really interesting in terms of energy efficiency improvements that happened across the lifetime of the lab. One interesting element of the whole lab was when we looked at what the percentage shares of households were reporting an inability to pay energy bills on time in evaluations and in the initial visits. And we could really see a huge drop in both the first and the second Living Lab iteration. So really reflecting the fact, I think that particularly there were many improvements, small improvements that helped save people energy, but also there was bill switching and so on, and some level of upgrades as well. Some of the biggest problems we encountered were really in the private sector, in the private rented sector, where there are severe structural problems around what you can do. And indeed, those sorts of residents had to sometimes ask for even for permission, just for the smallest measures from the landlords. And I think that's one of the sort of structural challenges we face at the moment. Sadly, in the third iteration, we did have an increase in that percentage, which I do attribute to the pandemic and also the timing of when we did the visits. But it does show, I think, again, we're still analyzing this, and it's very, very pervasive in the data. It does really show how bad, how detrimental the whole coronavirus crisis has been in terms of people, in terms of fuel poverty and fuel poverty rates, and people struggling with energy in their homes. And without really concerted interventions, without ambitious interventions right now, I really worry about the long-term impacts of what's happening. We did lots of regressions and analyses of, particularly in those first two iterations. I mean, you could really see what sort of drives things like reporting being inadequately warm or struggling to pay bills. We know these things. Electric heating, so lack of central heating, so people living in flats often, low income, social vulnerabilities as well. Those were one of the eligibility streams for the lab. I should add that people came to the lab through different streams. They can self-refer themselves, but also they would be picked up by local services on the grounds of income, on grounds of health, and also things like social vulnerability. If you are facing domestic violence, for example, or asylum seeker and so on, you would also be referred to these services as well. On struggling to pay bills, again, lack of insulation and low income. So, I mean, these are standard things that we do know, and they were confirmed. I should say about 80% of the people in our sample were receiving benefits, and these rates of people saying that they struggled with bills, and particularly, as you saw that before, but also saying that they struggled to keep warm were very, very high consistently. We gathered lots of qualitative data. I have little time to discuss this, and we have such a wealth of data from this, but I would say that again, it highlights some of the struggles that people have, but also the role that energy advisors do. So the qualitative data is entirely from the energy advisor's notes, and each advisor takes notes on each person that they visit. So you have or talk to. So there's a lot here to work with. One of the challenges, of course, is people were really sometimes struggling to or didn't want to do comparisons. People lacked appliances. They had huge debts. Someone had a debt of nearly £2,000 on his electricity account. Others basically struggled with finding ways of changing suppliers simply because they lack the infrastructures to do so, phone or internet and so on. So I think, again, this highlights in terms of low carbon transitions and justice, it's not just about energy efficiency or decarbonizing heat and so on. It's not about just the technologies. It's so much around the questions of participation and the sort of social infrastructures that you have to build to promote just transitions. And those social infrastructures or associated infrastructures, such as telephone and internet, are often missing for people who are excluded or marginalized. So I would say that a key effort in the future needs to be how you engage with, but also how you provide material means for switching, for improving their well-being to people who are on the more excluded end of the spectrum. We also did some energy cafes, again, showing really lots of people at the energy cafes, nearly over 200, again, showing how trust and use of energy technologies and issues, how we need to think about community building in just transitions, how we might think of increasing the agency of people who are excluded, political, social, economic, how we share knowledge. And in the last round, we did them online through drop-in chats. Not many people attended, but again, we saw how challenging it was to do these things and think of communities and so on in this particular way during the pandemic. Okay, some concluding thoughts. Not wishing to take up lots of room. So I understand. Looking at the chat, there's quite a few questions. So what does an inclusive urban decarbonization in the context of energy intermediaries mean? How would I approach it? I'd say 3 elements here: equity and justice, making sure that energy poor, fuel poor households are included, targeted in the most comprehensive way possible. Engagement, making sure people are first and approaches and technologies are built that are responsive, that work with the grain of people's needs. Not being shoved down people's throats in a way, but really respond to the way people use energy. And finally, in terms of infrastructure, and there's lots of work on this now. Infrastructure is not just technical things. Infrastructure is also social infrastructure, how people relate to each other on an everyday basis. It's even the social reproduction work that's done inside households, very gendered work often. And I think this aspect of infrastructure needs to come into the equation when we develop these retrofit programs, when we think about just transitions. We can't think of them simply as ways of just improving jobs or just improving technologies or throwing money at particular regions. We need to think about the engagement mechanisms through which we deliver them. Thank you very much. That's my Twitter handle if you want to get in touch over Twitter or email, and I appreciate your time and attention. Thank you.
Stefan, Dragomir, thank you both. Very, very interesting presentations coming from quite different perspectives, but actually all still centering pretty much on the just transition. First thing to say is we've got a load of questions. We probably won't get to ask and answer all of them, but I'm sure both Stefan and Dragomir will commit to answering them online afterwards, because as I say, we won't do justice to all of the questions. First one is for Dragomir. It says, thanks for the great presentation. This is from Jean-Sebastian Brock. Thanks for the great presentation. Have the projects you are involved in been able to assess the multiple impacts of building renovation? Dragomir.
Yes, thanks a lot for that question. The straightforward answer is yes. We have tried to assess the wider or the multiple benefits of energy efficiency. There was a project called MBuild back in 2016, 2017 that actually was dedicated precisely on that. But if we have to be honest, no, we haven't achieved reliable results from that kind of assessment. And actually, that's related to both lack of data and lack of methodologies, reliable methodologies regarding certain areas of impact or wider impacts of energy renovation. So if we look at the local or the regional level, if we set any kind of territorial dimension and trying to assess the impact the building renovation on that dimension, we need a lot of localized data that we unfortunately do not have access to, especially in our region. And I was actually quite envious of the loads, the affluence of qualitative data that Stefan presented that's being gathered from the living labs. On the other hand, if we look how we should calculate and monetize the wider benefits of energy efficiencies within a single renovation project, we lack methodologies, especially methodologies that are accustomed to our particular conditions in the country and the region. So, and again, the data issue is still present. So this is why I also insisted in my presentation on the necessity to collect quantitative data, to combine them with qualitative research mechanism, so that we would be able to introduce also that kind of multiple benefits argumentation in the programs that or the campaigns that we are conducting in order to improve the engagement and the participation of vulnerable households. So basically, yeah, it's not an easy and straightforward response, but we still need a lot to do in that direction.
Okay, Dragomir, thanks very much. Stefan, we have a question from Gavin Killip. It says, who are these intermediaries exactly for retrofit? It sounds like you mean small businesses in the construction industry. By your definition, are intermediaries market actors, local government, or agencies, or all of them, I guess? Sorry, you're muted.
Sorry, apologies. It's all of them really, and we don't really have. I've been trying to search in the literature, and if there is something on this, please let me know, because I might have missed it. I did supervise a PhD student several years ago who did try to develop a typology, but never published her work. It's all of these. It's things that, I mean, it can be market actors. It's often charities, actually. And you also may have things like quangos as well that come into that group. So everyone who's not really the state or the citizen is effectively an intermediary. In our case, it was a private, I mean, we had about 50 that we engaged with, but I should have mentioned that it's a private company, Agility Eco, that's essentially engaged by the council to deliver LEAP, and then it's a charity, Energy Works. So those are the two ones that help deliver the advice. But, for example, the Carbon Co-op, which is a sort of NGO charity that works in Manchester, and there's many, many others that we work with. So, yes, it's a very, very variegated landscape, and we don't really have a good classification or understanding of what it does. And many, many times, these intermediaries are actually small businesses. That's very true. And again, another one of my PhD students who, again, didn't publish his work, did a lot of work on retrofit intermediaries in terms of private businesses. And sometimes they are very, very small. They're one-person firms. So, yeah, it's very diverse in terms of the landscape that's represented here. And it's not a very well-known landscape either. Okay,
could I just, a supplementary that leads on from that, hopefully I've paraphrased this question from Tina Fawcett correctly, but essentially the question she's asking is very interesting projects, the living labs and so on, but are we addressing yesterday's problems in the sense of they're about energy efficiency, energy inequality? What about the new issues that the transition presents in terms of, decarbonising, social support, literacy, and so on? So are we in danger of looking at yesterday's problem rather than the future problem, I think is the question.
Yeah, that's an absolutely very pertinent question. I think that's what my point about boilers, when I mentioned that, I think that's a real challenge at the moment, because, you are delivering things that are a little bit backward looking in terms of where the technology is going. I think so. It's a kind of yes and no answer here. A lot of the capacities that we are addressing in these living labs, or that we did address, don't necessarily have to do with what is a yesterday's or tomorrow's. It's both, because it's about making sure that people understand, are able to participate in the market and understand what they can do, but also have the social capacity to do so. So from that point of view, it does also really work in terms of decarbonisation as well. In many other ways as well, you have to think about the fact that the people who we work with are extremely vulnerable, and they don't have light bulbs in their homes. I mean, we're looking at this sort of that level of vulnerability. So we are really addressing some of the very basic questions. At a more fundamental level, what I think would be very nice is if there were a wider variety of schemes that are more decarbonisation orientated that these labs could refer to. So in a way, the labs don't necessarily they only reflect the landscape that's out there. So if there was a more ambitious program that, particularly around the decarbonisation of heat, I mean, that would be amazing, but there aren't that you could refer low carbon, low income households onto. Certainly not a well-functioning one. So in a sense, yes, many of our challenges are about issues that are now moving forward in the agenda, but in many ways also, I think from a social point of view, we address things that are coming up as well.
Fine. Okay, thanks, Stefan. Dragomir, final one for you, if I may. Do you think that best practice in this area across Europe is properly being shared? And if not, what should the evaluation community be doing to help improve the situation?
Well, honestly, I think that there is a great progress in the past years regarding the sharing of best practices around Europe, and actually Professor Bouzarovski had a big role to play in that through the Energy Poverty Observatory, but also there are other interfaces and a lot of events happening even despite the COVID implications around Europe. So I trust that the progress has been good. The one thing that I feel as a long-standing barriers is the transition of these practices towards different levels of governance. So yeah, the message is clear from the research community. There are a few policy actors that are engaged in the problem. But when we get into the issues of designing the actual support programs, trying to combine different sources of financing and focus it towards the problems on site, there the difficulties come, and we still need to address the capacity at the different levels of governance so that the message is not lost along the value chain. And from the other way around, so from grassroots intervention, there is still a lot to achieve, a lot to pursue. You know, again, taking the example from the Living Lab in Manchester, living clubs that are were also organized in several other countries in Western Europe. The results are so convincing that it's really a shame that we are not able to replicate that kind of practice at different areas, to study different local conditions and to take the example from the grassroots involvement to integrate it into the policymaking process.
Dragomir, thank you very much. We've run out of time for questions. There are a number more questions in the chat box, so I'll just ask Stefan and Dragomir to have a look at those and perhaps respond to them offline. Firstly, thank you to both Dragomir and Stefan for, as I say, fascinating presentations. Obviously stimulated quite a lot of thought. And to the audience out there, we've got a reasonably good audience, some good questions, some good comments. After the conference is finished, just so that you know, there will be a recording of this session, and indeed any sessions, which will be available, I think, up until mid-August to view. So you can also follow Energy Evaluation on LinkedIn and Twitter. We've now got a 15-minute break for a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, a snack and a restroom break before we commence on session 5. So again, final thing, just say very much thank you to our presentations and look forward to the next session in quarter of an hour. Thanks very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.